The tires screamed across the coastal highway at 2 a.m. 2 tons of luxury steel spun sideways down the road, ground over the divider, and slammed straight into the guardrail. Less than 30 feet from the hood, a woman stood in the middle of the lane, barefoot on the painted line, her face bruised, her thin nightgown stained with blood, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing at all. By every law of physics, at that speed, on that curve, she should have been dead. But the man behind the wheel cut the wheel. He chose the guardrail over her. His name was Sullivan Ashford, 33, tall and broad, shouldered in a tailored black suit, with gray eyes cold as the sea before a storm. And he was the one man in this city nobody dared call by name. He'd just destroyed a $500,000 car for a woman he'd never met. She didn't run when he crawled out of the wreckage with blood running into his eye. She just stood there and whispered 3 words that froze his blood. He's coming. The most powerful man on the coast, a woman with nothing left to lose, an empty road with no signal, and 3 hours before dawn changed everything. What happens next will make you rethink what you thought you knew about who's strong and who's weak. If this story moves you, drop a like and share it so someone who needs to hear it today will find it. Subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one. Now stay with me, because this one's only just begun. Sullivan dragged himself out of the block of steel that had once been his car, one shoulder driving against the warped doorframe, and the pain in his left ribs cut across his breath like a thin blade. Blood from the gash on his forehead ran down, warm and salty, gathering at the corner of his right eye until half his world blurred into a red haze. He lifted his wrist and wiped his face, and in the faint light, still spilling from one headlamp that hadn't shattered, he saw the watch on his wrist, its glass face cracked into a spiderweb. The hand stopped at 2:07. It had stopped beating at the exact moment he turned the wheel. He looked at it for 1 second, then turned away, because this wasn't the time to feel anything. Before he allowed himself to feel the pain, before he even thought about the woman still standing a few steps away from him, the old instinct that had soaked into his blood over nearly 10 years rose first, cold and orderly. He swept his eyes along the road. A man like him didn't survive to his age by letting emotion speak before reason. Was anyone else here? Was there a vehicle parked hidden beyond the curve? Was there any blinking light in the brush signaling that a camera lens was recording? Was this an elaborate trap? A staged scene meant to lure him out of the car and finish him off? He had lived too long in a world where kindness was often bait, and coincidence was often conspiracy. But the road answered him with absolute silence. This was Route 1A. The narrow strip of asphalt running along the salt marsh north of the city, where land slowly dissolved into brackish pools that reflected the stars, where the smell of salty mud and dead seaweed rose thick in the night air. No houses, no streetlights, not a single porch roof for many kilometers around, only the wind pushing through the waist-high sedge grass and, somewhere below the dark slope, the slow sound of waves striking the rocks like the breathing of something enormous asleep. This was the kind of place people passed through but didn't stop in. The kind of place where if something happened, no one would know until daylight fully came. Sullivan shoved a hand into the pocket of his suit jacket, his numb fingers searching for his phone. The screen had a diagonal crack across it, but it still glowed. He lifted it, turned in a slow circle like a fool begging the sky, and watched the single bar of service trembling in the corner of the screen. 1 bar. He called Gage, his thumb leaving a faint smear of blood on the glass. The call hadn't even begun to ring when the last bar vanished, and the screen gave him back 2 cold words. No service. A dead zone. In the middle of this stretch of salt marsh, the nearest cell tower was little more than a rumor. The nearest town was tens of kilometers behind him, and he hadn't seen another car for almost an hour before everything shattered. So the calculation was clear. No signal, no car, one side of his ribs screaming every time he breathed in, and a man like him, a man the whole city feared, was now no different from anyone else stranded in the middle of nowhere. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and let the pain rush over him once, fully, then swallowed it down the way life had taught him to swallow everything. He braced one hand against the cold asphalt and forced himself up, piece by piece, the way large men still rose after falling, slowly and heavily. The whole road tilted for 1 beat, then gradually steadied again. And only then, once he was certain there was no trap, no lens, nothing but night and salt and the sound of waves, did he allow himself to turn fully toward her. She was still there, not moving, as if the whole world could collapse around her, and she would still stand exactly like that. Sullivan took a shallow breath, felt his ribs flare in protest, and began walking toward the woman for whom he had just thrown away $500,000, and perhaps several ribs too, the woman he had never met in his life. He moved closer, slowly, each step placed with purpose, and the nearer he came, the more the weak light from the remaining headlamp showed him things he didn't want to see. Sullivan had spent his life in a world where people learned to read another person's body the way they read a contract, line by line, mark by mark, every silence and every empty space saying what words tried to hide, and what he read on her body made something inside his chest tighten with a cold grip. On her neck, dim beneath her pale skin, were dark bruises arranged in a shape no one had to explain to him, the shape of a hand that didn't belong to her. Around her wrists were red marks circling the skin, as if they had been bound by something for too long and too tightly. Her feet were bare, scraped, streaked with dried mud, small cuts running along the soles, the kind of wounds a person only got from running a long way down a road never meant for bare feet. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had seen enough in his life to know this wasn't an accident, not someone lost, not a story that could be wrapped up in a comforting explanation. This was someone who had just escaped from somewhere, and that somewhere was still behind her, still breathing. Sullivan stopped when he was about 3 steps away from her. He didn't move closer. The instinct that had helped him survive now told him something very different, that for someone in her state, distance wasn't rejection but a gift, that anything large and male, and moving too close too fast, might be the last thing she could bear tonight. He raised his hand, slowly, then took off the black suit jacket still on his body, the expensive jacket now torn at one shoulder and stained with his own blood, and instead of draping it over her, or handing it straight to her, he bent down and placed it gently on the asphalt, within her reach but without touching her, then stepped back to the exact same spot. "The road's cold," he said, his voice rougher than he had expected, low and slow, as if he were speaking to a wild animal that hadn't yet decided whether it could trust him. "Sit down." The woman looked at the jacket, then she looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes truly landed on him instead of passing through him. And then she did something that made Sullivan, a man who had thought himself hardened against every pain the world could offer, feel his throat close. She didn't pick up the jacket. She didn't step toward it. She only slowly folded down and sat directly on the freezing asphalt, just one handspan away from the suit jacket, as if there were some rule inside her head, forbidding her from touching anything clean, as if no one had told her for far too long that she deserved to sit on something decent. Sullivan stood there and watched her sit on the road beside his jacket, and he said nothing, because there are moments when words only ruin everything. A long while passed before she finally spoke, her voice broken and dry as sand. "My name is Corinne," she said, then stopped, as if even that name hurt her. "People call me Rin." Sullivan nodded slowly and gave her his name. Only his name, without adding anything else, without the weight that name carried everywhere else in the world. She didn't ask who he was, didn't ask why he was driving alone in the middle of the night, didn't ask why he had turned the wheel instead of running her down. She only looked out at the dark road ahead, and in the desperate certainty of someone who had memorized her own fate, she said, "He'll find me. He always finds me." And Sullivan, who should have been walking back toward town by now to find a phone signal, who had no reason in this world to stay with a stranger in the middle of nowhere, found himself looking at the woman sitting on the road and knowing, as clearly as he knew his own name, that he wasn't going anywhere. Sullivan meant to say something, some reassurance, some question. But when he drew in a breath to speak, the pain in his ribs cut him off again, and though he tried to swallow it down the way he always did, this time it left a trace, a brief grimace, a hand rising unconsciously to clutch his left side, a breath caught halfway in his chest. He thought she was too deep inside her own pain to notice. He was wrong. Something in Rin changed in that exact moment, fast and decisive as a switch being flipped, and for the first time since he had seen her, those empty eyes weren't empty anymore. They sharpened, became alert, swept along his body with a kind of gaze he recognized at once, as the gaze of someone trained to see what other people missed. "Sit down," she said, and her voice was completely different, still hoarse, still broken, but now there was command beneath it, a quiet authority rising from somewhere so deep that 3 years hadn't erased it. "Left ribs. Right. You've been breathing shallow this whole time, and every time you inhale, you stop halfway." Sullivan looked at her, and for 1 second his familiar world tilted, because 2 minutes earlier, this woman had been sitting on the road, too afraid to touch a jacket, And now she was giving orders to him, the man no one in the whole city dared to order around, telling him to sit down. And he sat. He didn't understand why he obeyed, only knew there was something in her voice that didn't allow argument. Rin shifted closer, and this time, she was the one closing the distance, not him. And she did it without the slightest hesitation, as if in front of an injured body, all her own fear had to step aside. She reached for the hem of his expensive white dress shirt, a shirt that probably cost as much as her old month's wages, and tore a long strip from it with a clean motion that wasted nothing. He frowned slightly at the torn fabric. She didn't bother to notice. She had seen too many people die because someone cared too much about appearances. Her hand settled against his side, and Sullivan flinched not because of the pain, but because of the way those fingers moved, certain, gentle, pressing point by point in a sequence only someone properly trained would know. Feeling along each rib, reading his body with her fingertips like reading a page of raised letters. "Not fully broken," she said softly, almost to herself, "but cracked. At least one, maybe two. You're lucky. A little farther over and it would have punctured your lung." "Are you a doctor?" Sullivan asked, and it was the first honest question he had asked her. Her hand went still against his ribs for one very brief beat. "A nurse," she answered. Then after a silence, she added in a voice so small it was almost swallowed by the waves, "I used to be a nurse." And while she continued wrapping the strip of cloth around his chest, pulling it tight enough to hold but not tight enough to block his breathing, Sullivan looked down at the hands working on his body, hands small compared with his frame, and this time he saw what the darkness had hidden from him before. Across the backs of her hands and her wrists were scars, old and new, a small round one already healed near her wrist. One finger healed slightly crooked, no longer straight the way it should have been. Those hands carried an entire history he didn't need to be told, and yet those very hands were bandaging him now, steady and gentle, without the slightest tremor. And Sullivan, sitting there in the dark road with dried blood on his forehead and his ribs held together by a piece of his own shirt, suddenly thought something that hurt his chest more than the cracked bones did, that these hands that knew exactly what to do to keep a person alive, should have been in a brightly lit emergency room right now, saving someone, not kneeling on an empty road in the middle of the night, bandaging a stranger after running from her own life. She tied the final knot in the strip of cloth, then shifted back a little, and perhaps because she had just finished doing something familiar, something her hands remembered better than her mind did, something inside her loosened, and she began to speak, not in any order at all, each piece falling out like shards of glass picked up, without regard for the sequence in which they had broken. "They said I stole medication," she said, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead instead of on him. "Oxycodone. They said I was slipping it out of the department's medicine cabinet. I worked as a nurse there for 4 years and was never late once." Then she fell silent for a long while, and when she spoke again, she had jumped somewhere else entirely, as if the story inside her head had no straight line. "Everyone believed him," she said. "That was the worst part, you know. Dex was the person everyone liked. He remembered everyone's children's names. He helped neighbors shovel snow. He went to church every Sunday. When he said, 'My wife isn't well. My wife isn't right in the head. My wife stole medication,' the whole town nodded. Because how could a good man like Dex Pruitt lie?" Sullivan sat still, not saying a word, not nodding with comfort, not making a single promise, because he understood that there were some stories where the kindest thing you could do was let them be told all the way through, without cutting them apart with pity. "The medical board took my license," she went on. "No real proof needed. Just his word and a few papers he arranged himself. I called the police," she said, and this time a dry, bitter laugh slipped into her voice. "Do you know who always answered the call and came to my house? Trent Garvey, the sheriff, Dex's best friend since high school. Every time I called, Trent was the one who came, and every time, that report just disappeared, as if it had never existed, as if that night had never happened." At that point, Sullivan suddenly moved. He braced one hand against the road and tried to stand, and the pain in his ribs punished him at once, making him stop halfway with a breath hissing through his teeth, dragging them both back into the present, to the cold road, to dried blood, and the broken car. "What are you doing?" Rin asked, her professional instinct rising again. "Water," he answered shortly, dragging himself step by step toward the crumpled shell of the car. He fumbled through the jammed storage compartment, pulled out an unopened bottle of water, then came back and set it down beside her exactly the same way he had set down the jacket earlier, within reach but with no pressure. She looked at the bottle, then picked it up, this time without hesitating as long as she had with the jacket, and took a small sip. He sat down again, slower than before, and only after he was settled did he speak, and it was the first time he had said more than one sentence since she began telling the story. "I'm not going to tell you I believe you," he said, his voice low and flat, with no dramatics, no pity. "You've heard enough words like that already, and the word of a stranger in the middle of the road isn't worth any more than the rest." Rin lifted her eyes to him, frowning slightly, not understanding where he was going. "You don't need me to believe you," Sullivan continued, and he looked straight into her eyes as he said it. "You need you to believe you. Because as long as you still need a whole town to nod before you dare believe what you know is true, men like him still have you in their hands, no matter how far away they're standing." Rin didn't answer right away. She sat there, her scarred hands wrapped around the bottle of water, looking at the strange man who had just said the thing that, for the past 3 years, no one, not even she herself, had ever dared to say to her so plainly. And in those eyes that had once been empty, for the first time that night, something very small, very fragile, stirred. Sitting back, they both leaned against the ice-cold metal guardrail at the edge of the road, and from there they could look down the dark slope where the sea stretched all the way to the horizon, a vast blackness, distinguishable from the sky only by the occasional phosphorescent glimmer flashing on the crest of a wave. For a long time, neither of them said anything, and in that silence Sullivan found himself beginning to speak, something he had never done with anyone, not even the people closest to him in his world. "I used to know someone," he said, his eyes still on the sea. "A woman, my mother." He stopped, and Rin didn't hurry him. She only sat still and listened, in exactly the same way he had listened to her. "Her name was Pearl," he went on. "I didn't grow up beside her as much as I should have. They sent me away to boarding school very early, to schools very far away and very expensive. That's what families like mine do. They call it giving their children the best. But really it's to keep the children far away from the things the adults don't want them to see. All through my childhood, I thought my mother was the quietest woman in the world. I didn't understand why. I was too young to understand, and they made sure I would never be close enough to understand." Sullivan lifted a hand and wiped at the dried blood on his forehead, an unconscious gesture, as if he were brushing away something else. "I only truly understood when it was too late," he said. "When I was grown, when I had become exactly the man I am now, she got sick, and in her final days, when she was lying there with nothing left to lose, she held my hand and told me one sentence she had never dared to say in all the years before." He stopped for so long that Rin thought he might not continue. She said, "Don't ever become the kind of man your mother was afraid to leave." The sound of waves striking the rocks below filled the silence that followed those words. "She didn't need to tell me anything more," Sullivan said, his voice quieter now. "I was an adult by then. I understood. I understood that for more than 20 years, the only woman in the world I loved had lived inside a house she wasn't allowed to walk out of. And I, with everything I had, everything I had become, all the power people were afraid of, I hadn't saved her. I came too late. I understood everything right when there was nothing left to do except sit there and hold her hand." He turned to look at Rin, and for the first time that night, those cold gray eyes no longer looked cold at all. "So you see," he said, "I'm not a good man, Rin. I didn't stop the car tonight because I'm a good man." Rin was silent for a long time, her hands still wrapped around the bottle of water, her eyes fixed on the Black Sea. Then she spoke, slowly, one word at a time, as if she were choosing the words not for him, but for herself. "She didn't need you to save her," she said. Sullivan turned to look at her. "That woman, your mother, she didn't need a rich, powerful son to fly in, break down the door, and carry her away. That doesn't save anyone, because people go back, again and again. What she needed, what maybe she never had in her whole life, was someone, even just one person, to believe she deserved to be saved, to believe it before she could believe it herself." She lifted her eyes to him, and in the faint light of the night nearing its end, two people, wounded in two completely different ways, looked at each other and realized they had just told each other the same truth from opposite ends of it. And Sullivan suddenly understood that the thing he had said to her earlier about needing to believe herself was, after all, the very thing he had never been able to say to the woman he had come too late to save. They sat that way for a while longer, letting the silence between them settle, and then, from far away, behind them toward the inland road, a new sound slipped into the steady rhythm of the waves, the sound of an engine, low and even, growing louder. They both turned. Around the distant bend, two faint yellow points of light trembled into view, then grew into the headlights of a truck, a real vehicle, coming down the road where for hours there hadn't been a single soul. Rin shot to her feet so fast Sullivan didn't have time to react, rising on her scraped bare feet, her arm already lifting halfway, ready to wave, ready to scream for help, ready to gamble everything on the hope that the person behind that wheel was decent. "Don't," Sullivan said, and he reached up not to pull her back, but only to block her line of sight, his palm open, a request rather than an order. Rin froze, her arm still hanging in the air, her breath coming fast. "You don't know who's in that truck," he said quickly, his voice low and urgent. 4 o'clock in the morning, on a road nobody uses, one man alone behind the wheel. Maybe he's a good man on his way to work. Maybe he isn't. How many times have you bet on the kindness of strangers? And how many of those times did it save you? The question struck somewhere very deep, and Rin's arm slowly lowered. The truck roared toward them, its headlights sweeping over the two figures and the crushed steel on the roadside. And for one moment Sullivan thought it would stop, but then it only thundered past without slowing, the driver either not seeing anything in the dark or seeing it and deciding not to get involved, and only a few seconds later the red taillights shrank away and vanished beyond the next curve, leaving the road even quieter than before. Rin sat down again, slowly, and after a while she said softly, almost to herself, "You're right. I've trusted the wrong people too many times." Then she lifted her eyes toward the direction where the truck had disappeared, and her voice changed, becoming small and tight. "But it wouldn't matter whether it stopped or not," she said. "Do you know what road this is? This is Route 1A. This is the only road out of Millhaven in this direction. There's no other way. If you want to leave town heading north, this is it. And Dex knows I don't have a car. He knows I don't have money for a bus, no one to call for a ride. So when he wakes up and sees I'm not there anymore, he won't have to guess where I went. He only has to get in his car and drive this exact road, slowly, when it's light enough, and sooner or later he'll see me." Sullivan listened to her, and inside his head, running alongside every word she spoke, another calculation was moving, cold and precise the way it always moved. His car wasn't only a heap of broken steel, it also carried a tracking device Gage had quietly installed long ago, the kind that didn't need phone service, and by the agreement between them, when the car stayed still too long in an unplanned place, the system would automatically send out an alert. He knew that alert had almost certainly gone out already. He knew Gage, the moment he received it, wouldn't call, wouldn't text, but would leave at once. But he also knew how far it was from the city to this stretch of salt marsh, and he knew that no matter how fast Gage drove, it would still be a few hours before his people could reach this place. He looked east, where the horizon was still pitch black but would not stay black forever, and he understood that the real race tonight wasn't about who would arrive. It was about who would arrive first. Perhaps because she had just heard him speak about his mother, because she had just seen those cold eyes open onto something deeply human, Rin turned to look at him with a new question. The first time that night she was the one examining him instead of the other way around. "What about you?" she said. "What do you do that has you driving a car worth $500,000 alone in the middle of the night, on a road that leads nowhere at 2 o'clock in the morning? Normal, decent people are asleep in their homes at this hour." Sullivan was silent for a moment, and Rin saw something close inside him, not avoidance, but calculation, as if he were deciding how much was enough to let her know. "I do things that keep me from sleeping," he finally said. "Driving at night is how I pretend I'm going somewhere, instead of just running from myself." Rin didn't laugh, but she didn't let him off either. "That's not an answer," she said softly. "That's a poem." This time, the corner of Sullivan's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. "You want the real answer?" he asked. "I think I deserve to hear it," she replied, "after everything I've told you." Sullivan nodded slowly, accepting the logic of that. "There are cities," he said, "where certain names aren't spoken out loud. People lower their voices when they mention them, or they don't mention them at all. They just nod in a direction and everyone understands who they mean. My name is one of those names." He let the sentence hang between them for a while, giving her room to understand the rest for herself. "I'm not the police," he continued. "I'm not the person you call when you're in trouble with the law. I'm the kind of person people call when the law won't help them, and they're willing to pay any price, to accept whatever comes with it." Rin sat very still. She had lived 3 years beside a man the whole town believed was decent, but who was really something else entirely, so she knew the feeling of sitting beside something more dangerous than it appeared, and by every ordinary rule, she should have been afraid. A woman who had just run from a dangerous man, sitting in the middle of nowhere with a man even more dangerous, should have stood up and moved away. But she didn't move away. She looked at the man who had turned the wheel and driven his car into the guardrail, instead of running her down. The man who had placed his jacket on the road 3 steps away instead of crowding close. The man who had sat and listened to her story without interrupting once. And she realized something strange, that she wasn't afraid of him, even though reason told her she should be. "Should I be afraid of you?" she asked, almost to herself. Sullivan looked at her. "I scare a lot of people," he answered honestly. "But not me," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No," he admitted, "not you." Rin turned to look toward the dark road, where Dex would appear when morning came, then looked back at the man sitting beside her, and for the first time in many months, she felt something whose name she had almost forgotten, something very much like safety, though it came from a place she could not possibly have expected. "There's one more thing you should know," Sullivan said, his eyes also on that road. "When someone like me disappears from sight for too long, someone always comes looking. They're already on their way. I just don't know for certain whether they'll get here first, or whether your man will." And in the silence that followed those words, they both looked toward the east, where the black sky had begun thinning into a very faint gray, and they both understood that dawn was coming, and with it, everything dawn would bring. The thin gray along the horizon hadn't yet warmed when the road brought them another sound, and this time Rin recognized it before she saw anything, because her body reacted before her mind did, her shoulders shrinking, her head lowering, her scarred hands tightening around each other, her whole body folding into a smaller shape, as if instinct were trying to hide her away. This engine didn't sound like the truck from earlier. It came from the south, from Millhaven, and it didn't slow as it approached the wrecked steel beside the road the way a decent person would have. A white pickup tore toward them, braked hard at the last moment, its tires grinding against the asphalt, then slid sideways and blocked nearly the whole road. "That's him," Rin said, and it wasn't a question. Her voice was flat and dead, in the way of someone who had already known the ending of her own story. The doors flew open, and 3 men stepped down. The first man to step down looked nothing like what people imagined when they thought of someone frightening. He was average height, clean, wearing a plaid flannel shirt so neatly pressed it looked as if it had just come from a closet. His hair combed into place, and on his face was a smile, an easy, warm smile. Exactly the kind of smile worn by the neighbor everyone said was such a good man. The man who helped shovel snow and remembered their children's names. The second man stepped out from the passenger seat and was entirely different. Tall, broad, shouldered, his face heavy and sullen, standing a little behind with both hands hanging at his sides, a silent mass of flesh waiting only to be ordered. And the third man, stepping down from the back, wore a uniform, with a metal badge on his chest catching what little light the early morning offered, a gun holster at his hip, and he stood there with the posture of someone used to no one daring to argue with him. Sullivan, still sitting against the guardrail, didn't move, but his eyes had swept over all 3 men in less than 2 seconds, reading them, sorting them, and the conclusion he reached sent a coldness down his spine, not from fear, but from understanding. The smiling man walked a few steps forward, both hands raised in front of him in an open, gentle gesture, as if he were the one reassuring everyone here. "Thank God," he said, and his voice was soft, warm, filled with such sincere concern that if Sullivan hadn't just spent hours listening to the story, maybe even he would have believed it. "Rin, sweetheart, I've been looking everywhere for you all night. I was worried sick." He turned to Sullivan, still wearing that same caring smile. "Thank you for staying with her, friend. I truly appreciate it. My wife, she isn't well in the head, you understand. She has unstable episodes. Sometimes she wanders off in the middle of the night, hurts herself, then tells stories that aren't true. Her doctor is treating her. I'm sorry she bothered you." Then the man in uniform stepped forward once, set his hand on his belt, and spoke in the dry, even voice of authority. "I'm Sheriff Garvey, Millhaven County," he said. "This woman has been reported missing by her family. Thank you for your cooperation. We'll take care of the rest now." And sitting there on the cold road with his ribs bound in a strip of his own shirt, Sullivan understood completely the position he had just fallen into. This wasn't a fight he could solve with fists. One abuser he could handle. But this was a concerned husband, a badge, a missing person report, a story arranged neatly down to every detail. These weren't 3 thugs blocking a road. This was an entire machine, and that machine carried papers saying it stood on the side of what was right. Sullivan set one hand on the cold guardrail and began to stand. And the act took more out of him than he wanted anyone to see, because the moment he put weight into his legs, his cracked ribs screamed in protest and the whole road tilted before his eyes for one swaying beat, a pool of darkness spreading and then shrinking back. But he was too used to standing upright when his body wanted him to collapse. So he waited for the world to balance itself again, then rose to his full height, large and silent, and took one step away from the rail to place himself directly between the 3 men and the woman still curled behind him. He said nothing at all. He didn't offer some clever threat, didn't throw out a sharp line. He simply stood there, blocking the road with his body, and let the 3 men make the calculation his presence forced them to make. The smile on Dex's face didn't disappear, but it stopped moving, freezing into something that was no longer warm. The large man behind him, the one Sullivan would later learn was named Wade, shifted his weight slightly onto his other foot, the small movement of an animal measuring an opponent. "Friend," Dex said, his voice still sweet as before, though now there was a taut thread hidden underneath it. "I don't know who you are, and I'm sure you're a good man, but this is a private family matter. You shouldn't get involved. She's my wife." Sullivan looked at him for a long while, and when he spoke, his voice was low, even, not raised by even an inch. "I see 5 marks on her neck," he said. 5 marks, arranged exactly like a hand. He paused, letting that sentence hang in the cold morning air. What kind of private family matter leaves marks like that on a woman's throat? This time, Dex's smile vanished completely. For a flash, something very different crossed that clean face, so quickly it was almost impossible to see, and then he pulled the calm mask back into place. But Sullivan had already seen the real man underneath, and they both knew he had seen it. Trent, the man in uniform, immediately stepped forward once, placing his hand on the holster at his side, not to draw the gun, only to make sure everyone saw it was there, and he spoke in the cold official voice of someone used to being obeyed. "You're obstructing an officer in the performance of his duty," he said. "I can arrest you right now for that. You should think very carefully about what you're doing. A strange man, injured, with no papers, standing in the road at dawn and interfering with police work. How do you think that's going to look in a report?" Sullivan didn't answer right away. Instead, in one very brief moment whose meaning only he understood, his eyes left the 3 men and flicked quickly north, toward the empty stretch of road leading back toward the city, where, if every calculation in his head was right, something was already on its way. He counted again in his mind, the time since the car had stopped, the distance from the city to here, and he knew that window still hadn't opened, that if he had to manage this alone, he would have to manage it alone a while longer, maybe a very long while. Then his eyes returned, settling directly on Trent, calm as if they had never moved. "Go ahead," he said. "Arrest me. Cuff me. Take me back to your station. Call the county. Call the state if you want. I'll be more than happy to tell all of them why a sheriff drove all the way out to the middle of nowhere at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning to return a woman with bruises on her throat to the man who put them there." Trent stood still. His hand remained on the holster, but it didn't move another inch. Sullivan saw that hesitation, that moment when the hand on the holster stopped, and he knew he had just found a crack in the wall. So he pressed into it, not hurriedly, not loudly, only with the steady voice of a man reading numbers he had already memorized. "Sheriff Garvey," he said. "I wonder, if someone sat down and counted very carefully, how many reports they would find that should exist but don't anymore. 14, isn't that right? Over 2 years. 14 times a woman called for help, and 14 times that piece of paper evaporated before it could reach anyone who might actually do something." Trent's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "You think this is a small-town matter?" Sullivan went on. "You think here, you are the law, but deliberately destroying records, covering things up, abusing authority under the color of office. Those things don't stop at your county line. That's federal. And I promise you, when the men in suits from the FBI open that file, they won't file it in a drawer marked family matter. Do you want to gamble your whole career, that badge, the rest of your life, on me being wrong? The silence after that question said more than any answer could have. And it was in that silence that Wade, the large man who had been standing still like a wall of flesh all this time, lost his patience. He couldn't stand the sight of an injured, unarmed man standing there and talking as if he were the one holding the power. So he stepped forward, shoulders tensing, his broad hands clenching and opening again, the way a man did when he was used to using the size of his body to make other people step back before he ever had to lay a hand on them. Sullivan didn't step back. He didn't even change his stance. He only turned his gray eyes toward Wade, and when he spoke, his voice was so flat it was chilling, as even as a man reading tomorrow's weather report. "You raise a hand to me," he said, "and before that sun fully clears the water, everything you have will be gone. The vehicle you drive, the house you rent, the place you think no one knows about, your name, the thing you carry every time you apply for a job, every time you sign your name, all of it." He paused for one beat. "I'm not threatening you," he said. "Threats are what men make when they can't do what they say. I'm only telling you in advance what the process will look like, so later you can't say no one warned you." Wade stopped halfway through his step, and what stopped him wasn't fear of a punch, because he was 1.5 times bigger than the man in front of him, and he knew it. What made him stop was the way that man spoke about his destruction, with absolute calm, without a ripple of emotion, as if it wasn't a threat at all, but only a truth already settled, something certain to happen as naturally as the tide coming in. He looked into those gray eyes, and for the first time, he understood that the man sitting on the side of the road with dried blood on his forehead wasn't an unlucky traveler caught in an accident, but something else entirely. Something his deepest instinct told him he shouldn't touch. He glanced toward Dex, waiting for an order, waiting for someone to tell him what to do, because for the first time in his life, his mass of muscle didn't give him the answer. Dex saw Wade stop short, saw Trent rooted in place, and as a man who had spent his whole life reading other people and knowing when to change tactics, he changed at once. He didn't move toward Sullivan. Instead, he stepped around to one side, letting his line of sight pass beyond the large man and land straight on the woman curled behind him. And when he spoke, his voice had changed completely. It was no longer the voice he used with a stranger, but something low, warm, gentle. A voice honed over 3 years to slip into the deepest corners of her. "Rin," he called, almost in a whisper. "Look at me. Don't look at him. Look at me. You know I love you. You know how confused everything gets. I know you're tired. I know. Come home with me. We'll talk. Just the two of us. I promise this time will be different. I'm not angry. I could never be angry with you. You belong at home, sweetheart, not out in this cold place with a man you don't even know." And Rin went completely still. Not from the cold. Her whole body began to tremble from the inside. Because that voice knew its way through her. It had traveled that path thousands of times. It knew exactly where to press. And some part of her, the part she hated most, the part that had grown used to being told what to do and feeling relieved when she didn't have to decide for herself. That part was rising up and wanted to stand, wanted to walk toward the truck, wanted to let everything slide back into its familiar rut. She lowered her eyes to her hands, clenched tight in her lap. She looked at the small round scar healed over on her wrist. She looked at the finger that had healed slightly crooked, the finger that would never straighten properly again. 3 years of history lay right there on her own skin, something no sweet voice could rewrite. She lifted her eyes to Sullivan, the stranger who had turned the wheel and driven into a guardrail instead of running her down, the man who had placed his jacket 3 steps away from her, the man who had sat through the long night listening to her without interrupting once, the man who now stood in the middle of the road with his injured body for no reason except that he had chosen to. Then she looked at Dex, and she stood. She rose slowly on her aching bare feet, her whole body still trembling, but when she opened her mouth, the voice that came out didn't shake at all. For the first time in 3 years, it rang clear and certain and entirely her own. "No," she said, "I'm not going back." 3 words. Only 3 short words. But to her they weighed as much as the mountain she had spent 3 years climbing to reach the top. And the moment they left her mouth, Something inside her chest broke open and healed at the same time, and Dex changed. The decent mask, the warm smile, the worried husband's tenderness, all of it fell away at once like a curtain ripped from a window, and what showed behind it was a face the town of Millhaven had never seen, twisted by something both cold and wild. "You have nothing," he hissed, and his voice was completely different now. "No money, no home, no career, not one person in this world believes you. Where do you think you're going? What are you without me?" He signaled Wade with a sharp jerk of his head, and the big man, freed from his hesitation by an order, lunged forward. And at the same time, Trent, understanding that every cover had fallen away and that there was only one way left to drag everything back under control, pulled the gun from its holster and aimed it straight at the center of Sullivan's chest. Sullivan didn't move when the black barrel of the gun pointed at the center of his chest. He had stood in front of enough guns to know that the first reaction, that startled flinch, was exactly the thing that made people pull the trigger. So he only stood still, slowly raised both hands to shoulder height, palms open, and when he spoke, his voice was still that same even voice from before, not a beat faster. "Have you thought this through, Garvey?" he said. "A sheriff shooting an unarmed man, with no weapon, on a federal highway at dawn. How are you planning to write that into a report? You think no one will come count the shell casings? No one will measure the distance? No one will ask why a man with nothing in his hands fell that far away from you? You pull that trigger, and what you're shooting isn't me. What you're shooting is the rest of your own life." Trent's gun hand wavered slightly, only a little, but enough to see, and in that very moment of hesitation, all of them heard it. At first it was only a faint hum, tangled with the wind and the waves, coming from the north, from the empty stretch of road leading back toward the city. Then it grew louder. Then it became exactly what it was, the deep, heavy roar of multiple powerful engines running at full speed and close together, a wall of sound rolling over the road, growing louder, louder, until it swallowed the sea completely. Wade stopped halfway through his step. The muzzle of Trent's gun shifted away from Sullivan's chest. At the crest of the northern slope, 4 black vehicles appeared, large, gleaming, moving in formation, and they didn't slow until the very last second. Then all 4 spread out and came to a hard stop across the road, their noses angled in different directions, their headlights tearing through the gray dawn. The signal had gone out. Someone had seen it. And when a man like Sullivan disappeared for too long, people didn't call, didn't text. They came. All of them came. The doors opened. Men stepped out, silent, dressed in dark clothes, clean and controlled, not one of them in a hurry. And leading them was a broad-shouldered man with an old scar running across one eyebrow, his eyes sweeping over the entire scene in only a few seconds, reading everything. His injured man, the woman with bruises, the uniformed man with the gun, the big man standing frozen. That man, Gage Holloway, didn't draw a weapon. He walked straight toward Trent, and when he stopped, he didn't speak loudly. His voice was only loud enough for everyone to hear, and he didn't threaten with the number of men standing behind him. He threatened with something else. "Dexter Pruitt," he said, his eyes still on Trent, though the name was thrown toward the man in flannel. "Pharmacist license revoked. Currently distributing prescription drugs through a network running across 3 counties. We have names, dates, and numbers." His gaze shifted to Trent. "Sheriff Trent Garvey. 14 reports erased in 2 years. A bank account with deposits your salary can't possibly explain." Then to the large man. "Wade Pruitt. Prior assault conviction. Currently on probation. And your presence here this morning alone is enough to send you back to the place you just got out of." He read all of it in the calm voice of a man reading a grocery list. "I know who you are," Gage said. "Now you know that we know. The only question left this morning is whether you want to drive away on your own, or whether you want all of this on the FBI's desk by Monday morning." Trent was the first to lower the gun. He tipped the barrel down, then slowly slid it back into the holster, as if the weapon itself had turned hot in his hand. Dex looked around, at the 4 vehicles, at the silent men, at Rin, and for one moment, that wildness flashed in his eyes again. But even he could do the calculation. 3 men, 1 gun, against everything standing in front of them. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice had lost all its weight. "It's over," Sullivan answered from behind him, quietly. "You just haven't realized it yet." And without another word, the 3 men climbed back into the white pickup, backed out in a crooked turn, then sped away in the direction they had come from, while everyone stood still and watched until the last dust settled back onto the road, and the silence took the road again. When the dust had fully settled and the white pickup was nothing more than a small dot before disappearing, the strength Sullivan had been forcing into himself to remain standing all this time drained away with it, and his legs buckled. Gage was already there, one firm hand catching his elbow before he could hit the ground, lowering him carefully onto the asphalt. "Ribs?" Gage asked, clipped and brief. "Cracked," Sullivan answered through a hiss of breath. "Maybe 2. "You're insane," Gage said, without a trace of surprise in his voice. "I know," Sullivan replied. Rin stood a few steps away, and she wasn't looking at the two of them. She was looking at the 4 black vehicles, at the silent men standing around them with the posture of people for whom violence wasn't an impulse but a paid profession, looking at the way all of them waited, watching the injured man sitting on the road as if he were the sun they orbited. And piece by piece, the picture in her mind came together into something chillingly clear. The man who had turned the wheel for her, the man who had listened to her all night, the man who had told her she needed to believe herself. That same man was also the kind of man whose disappearance for a few hours was enough to send 8 men in 4 cars immediately out to find him. She stepped closer to him, and when she spoke, her voice no longer carried the woundedness of the night before. It was alert now, wary, sharpened. "Who are you?" she asked. "Not your name. I want to know what you really are." Sullivan looked up at her from where he sat on the ground, and he didn't avoid the question. "You've seen it," he said. "You've seen who came. You're smart enough to put the rest together." "I just escaped from one monster," Rin said, and her voice trembled, not from fear, but from a deep, exhausted anger. "I don't need another one." Sullivan nodded slowly, as if that were a fair answer and one he had expected. "That's right," he said, without a hint of defense. "I am that kind of man. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you about it. Not after you spent an entire night being that honest with me." He lifted a hand to his chest, grimaced, then continued. "But I'm not offering you anything, Rin. I'm not offering to take you anywhere. Not offering to step into your life. Not offering you something you have to be grateful for. That's the trap, isn't it? A man saves you, and then assumes that from that moment on, you belong to him. I don't do that." He reached into the pocket of the suit jacket still lying on the road where she had sat beside it all night, pulled out a business card, turned it over, and with the hand he could still move, wrote a string of numbers on the back. Then he placed it on the asphalt, exactly the way he had placed everything in front of her all night, close enough to reach but without forcing it on her. "This is the number of a lawyer," he said. "Not the kind of lawyer you're thinking of when you look at those cars. She specializes in exactly the kind of thing that happened to you. Domestic abuse, restraining orders, getting back a professional license that was wrongfully taken. She's good, and she'll believe you even if that whole town doesn't." Rin looked at the business card on the road, then looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all of this?" Sullivan was silent for a long time, his eyes on the sea where the sun was finally rising from the waterline. "Because my mother," he said softly, "never had anyone hand her a business card, and she understood that this was the whole answer. That there would be nothing more than that, and that it was already more than enough." 6 months passed, and winter on the coast gave way to a slow, windy spring. Rin stood before the medical board once more, but this time not as someone accused, but as a witness, and this time she had an attorney sitting beside her, the woman whose phone number had been written on a business card and placed in the middle of an empty road at dawn. The truth, once someone was willing to listen to it, turned out not to be as hard to find as people believed. The records of the missing medication led straight back to the very person who had accused her of taking it. The prescription drug distribution ring running across 3 counties was dragged into the light, and Dexter Pruitt was prosecuted, not for what he had done to her behind closed doors, but for the numbers in his ledgers, the kind of thing no gentle smile could hide anymore. Trent Garvey lost his badge when the federal office reopened the exact 14 reports he had thought were gone forever, and Rin got her license back. The morning she stepped back into the emergency room after 3 years, wearing the uniform she had once believed she would never be allowed to wear again, she stood in front of that door for a very long time before pushing it open. On her first night shift, when an emergency case was wheeled in, she looked down at her hands and saw that they were steady, not trembling at all. The finger that had healed slightly crooked was still there, and it would always be there, but it didn't stop her from holding a needle, didn't stop her from placing a breathing tube, didn't stop her from doing the work those hands had been born to do. History still lived on her skin, but it no longer controlled her. As for Sullivan, he didn't become a good man in the way stories often promise. He didn't walk away from his world. There was no bright salvation pulling him out of the man he had always been. His world remained gray, quiet, and dangerous, the way it had always been. But he did one thing. He created a fund, not under his name, with no one knowing where the money came from. A fund that did only one thing: paying for attorneys, safe housing, and the restoration of lost careers for women who ran in the middle of the night with no one to call. Gage managed it, quietly, the way he managed everything else. Late one night, in the back room of a restaurant, when only the two of them remained, Gage finally asked the question he had kept inside for 6 months. "I still don't understand," Gage said. "You drive better than that. That night, you had more than enough skill to steer around her without hitting the guardrail, without destroying the car, without those ribs. Why did you do it?" Sullivan didn't answer right away. He looked down at the watch on his wrist, the watch he had never had repaired, its glass still cracked into a spider web, the two hands still frozen at 2:07, the moment when everything stopped and everything began. "In the headlights," he said. "In that half a second, I saw her eyes, and I realized she wasn't going to move. She was standing there, and she didn't want to get out of the way." He paused for a while. "So I got out of the way for her," he said. Gage didn't ask anything more, because there are things about who a person truly is that don't show themselves during the long years when there is enough time to calculate, arrange, and build a face for the world to see, but instead reveal themselves in one brief half-second, when there is no time left to think. And what we choose in that half-second, when there is no time to pretend, is who we really are. A man the whole city thought was a monster turned the wheel to save a stranger. A woman the whole town thought was a liar stood up and spoke the truth. And perhaps the lesson that remains after all of it is this: that the value of a human being doesn't lie in the label the world puts on them, doesn't lie in a frightening appearance or a broken past, but in what they choose to do when another life is placed in their hands. That kindness doesn't need a reward, and true courage isn't the absence of fear, but speaking even while trembling. Sometimes, the person who most needs salvation is the very one who reaches out to save someone else first. If this story has touched something inside you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so each day you can join us in listening to many more meaningful stories. How do you feel about Sullivan and Rin's story? Which moment moved your heart the most? Please leave a comment and share what you feel from deep inside your heart, because we truly want to hear what you think. Thank you for staying until the very final second. We wish you, the person watching this video right now, abundant health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.